So Pikmin 4 has been out for a little over 2 weeks now, and I've been able to play through the main story as well as some of the side content in the game. Overall, this game is slowly becoming one of my favorite games of all time. It has a satisfying gameplay loop that builds off of the formula of both Pikmin 2 and 3. On top of that, this game includes every Pikmin type from the previous games in the main story, except for the Baldman, unfortunately. Across the board, most of the types are fairly balanced, but some of them are definitely more useful than others. So in this video, I will be ranking the Pikmin types in Pikmin 4 based on both their usefulness and how likely I am to use them in the game. So without further ado, let's rank those Pikmin. In previous games, yellow Pikmin were actually pretty useful. On top of their signature ability to be thrown high in the first game, they could also carry Bob Rocks, which were actually fairly important late in the game. Ever since Pikmin 2, their elemental ability has been their resistance and conductivity to electricity, which has served to be useful in many areas of both Pikmin 2 and 3. While this ability did return in Pikmin 4, I found that their electricity resistance isn't nearly as useful as it was in previous games. There are not as many electrical hazards and enemies as there were in previous games, and even compared to other elemental hazards in this game, at least in the required sections. There aren't even any electrodes in this game, which were the circuits that utilized yellows in Pikmin 3. On top of that, their main ability to be thrown higher has also been outclassed this time. Any item on a high surface can be knocked down by Ochi's Rush ability, which is available near the start of the game. The only real advantage that yellows seem to have in this game is faster digging speed, which is weird because they're the only type in the game to have a different digging speed. However, that is also something that Ochi can do effectively early in the game, which is also an easily upgradable ability. So overall, yellow Pikmin have undoubtedly been nerfed the most out of all types, since they are the least useful overall in my opinion. Most of the things that they can do can be done by Ochi. I was actually very surprised by this, since yellows have always received some kind of upgrade in each subsequent title. And it's disappointing, since yellows have to be one of the cutest designs in my opinion. How can you not love those ears?
What is wrong with you? Why are you blue?
Blue Pikmin have always been known to be one of the least useful types in each game. Functionally, they were really just a way to travel or retrieve objects in the water, since they were the only type resistant to water. So most of the time, they're relegated to being used as a tool for bodies of water throughout the series. Once again, in Pikmin 4, they possess no other ability, which is why they are lower on the list. This time, some of their abilities have even been outclassed by Ochi, as you can travel the water easily with Ochi very early in the game. And Ice Pikmin also have the ability to freeze water. Even later in the game, Ochi can gain the ability to pick up items underwater, once again outclassing the Blue Pikmin. However, Blue Pikmin aren't completely useless, and are actually very useful during certain segments of the game, which is why they are above the Yellows. Pikmin 4 contains much more water than the previous Pikmin games. I'm surprised IGN didn't give it a 7.8 out of 10. And that makes blues required for many different treasures, or unlocking certain parts of the map. This is especially the case for Serene Shores, which is essentially impossible without Blue Pikmin, since a large portion of the map is covered in water for half of the day. On top of that, the caves in this area also utilize the blues, making them relatively useful. Like the Engulfed Castle, for instance, which requires blues to enter, similar to a certain other castle from Pikmin 2. The winged Pikmin don't appear until much later in the game compared to the previous two that I mentioned, but I have mixed feelings on them this time. In Pikmin 3, they were great and very useful, since there were multiple required or recommended fruit to use wings for, and they also took the fastest possible route back to the Onion. However, in Pikmin 4, they were downgraded in multiple ways. Rather than taking a direct route back to the Onion, sometimes they take an unnecessarily long or convoluted route sometimes directly based on the path of other Pikmin types, like blue Pikmin for instance. On top of that, they removed the gates from Pikmin 3 that could be lifted by wings. This often limits the situations where I would use wings, making them much less useful in this game. Even with their nerfed ability, I still find them to be fairly useful in a lot of instances. Like, they're still a very viable option for moving treasures across some larger maps in the game, as well as caves containing bottomless pits. Once again, like in Pikmin 3, they are useful for carrying objects above the water or over obstacles that would otherwise harm Pikmin. So, wings are pretty useful in some instances, but I don't really see myself using them that often, but they would be much better if they flew directly back to the onion, rather than on a fixed path. So, the white Pikmin were very hard to rank for me, since they are still very good in Pikmin 4, but their use seems much more limited than it was in Pikmin 2, so I decided to place them somewhere in the middle. So, white Pikmin are functionally very similar to how they were in Pikmin 2. They are the fastest type by a significant margin, and they can poison enemies when ingested. Thankfully, their poison ability has been restored to be nearly as powerful as it was in Pikmin 2, since it was nerfed significantly in the mission mode of Pikmin 3, where they did appear in that game. Like, for example, it took 5 white Pikmin to kill a Bulborb, but in Pikmin 4, it only takes 1, similar to how it was in Pikmin 2. Poison hazards also return in Pikmin 4, in a new form called Mold, which is prevalent in multiple caves in the later part of the game, as well as in the final area. There are even a few new enemies, such as the Toxstol or the moldy Dwarf Bulborbs, that contain poison, making it only possible for white Pikmin to defeat them without other Pikmin taking damage from the poison. The problem with white Pikmin, though, is their extremely limited availability, at least in the main story. I didn't even encounter white Pikmin until a cave in the second to last area of the game, and only got about 30 in total throughout the whole story. Their onion is also extremely hard to get, and it requires playing through certain missions and side modes. I can understand why they did that for the purple onion, but white Pikmin are fairly balanced in Pikmin 4, so I don't see why they'd have to make you go through so many hurdles in order to unlock the onion for them. But yeah, white Pikmin were implemented fairly well in Pikmin 4, but their availability is extremely limited. Red Pikmin have always been the first type that you encounter throughout the Pikmin series, and Pikmin 4 is no exception. Reds basically act as the standard Pikmin type, and they're usually the most balanced type. Like in previous games, they have a higher attack power than most types, and they are also resistant to fire hazards. This time, Reds are even more useful for the latter, because there's quite a lot of fire hazards and enemies in Pikmin 4. There are also entire sections of the ground in some caves that are covered in a molten material that only Reds can walk on and remove. In later areas of the game, they even add a new mechanic with an item called a fire starter that only Reds can carry. Fire starters can be used to burn down piles of hay and even warming up freezing rooms within a cave. They can also be used in combat as well, since they can melt the ice off of a frozen type enemy. Overall, while being a fairly balanced standard type, Red Pikmin are even more useful than they were in past games due to the more in-depth use of their fire resistance ability. Now we're moving on to some of the best types in the game, the types that are generally useful in most non-elemental scenarios in the game. So, the Rock Pikmin were already great in Pikmin 3. They had the highest attack power, were resistant to crushing and stabbing, as well as being able to break glassy objects. In Pikmin 4, they thankfully retained all of these abilities, but they've even been improved with some aspects. Now, when being thrown at an enemy, they deal more than double the damage that Reds and Purple deal when latched onto an enemy. However, like in Pikmin 3, they can't latch onto an enemy, so you have to constantly throw them at enemies, but this isn't a problem at all, because it makes them more balanced overall. One slight nitpick that I have is but there's fewer scenarios where you use rocks to break objects, so I wish they would have had more of those glassy walls and crystals within Pikmin 4. Despite that, rock Pikmin are still great in most combat situations in the game, and are very helpful for almost every enemy encounter, especially the ones with more health later in the game. There's quite a lot of enemies that can crush Pikmin, possibly be even more than in previous games, so the rocks are generally pretty useful. One significant addition to Pikmin 4 was the night mode. This mode sort of functions like a tower defense game, where you have to protect the luminol from enemies in order for it to produce glow sap to cure leaflings. With this new mode, they also added a brand new Pikmin type called the Glow Pikmin. Glows aren't really a traditional Pikmin type, like all of the others in 4, since they don't have an onion and they can't be used during the surface during the daytime. They're more closely related to Bulbmin in functionality, since they are only limited to night mode and the caves. That being said, they are easily the most overpowered types in the game, since like the Bulbmin, they are immune to all elemental hazards. This is great for caves, as caves usually are designed around certain hazards, so if you don't have enough reds to deal with fire, or blues to deal with water, you can just pull out some glow seeds. On top of their immunity to hazards, they also do a stun attack on enemies. While it's not as devastating as freezing the enemies, this stun attack is still very useful, and it immediately disperses the glows onto the enemy's weak points. If the glow Pikmin weren't limited to caves, they would easily be the best in the game, but limiting them to caves does make them more balanced and situational. The next type isn't just great overall, but it's borderline overpowered, especially when used with other strong Pikmin types. The Ice Pikmin is one of the new types in Pikmin 4, and as a result, much of the game is designed around their abilities. Ice Pikmin are not as strong or fast as most other types, but they have the ability to freeze enemies, as well as freeze water, and are resistant to both ice and bubble hazards. In combat, the freezing ability is really effective against most non-ice enemies. The enemy is completely motionless for several seconds, allowing for other types to effortlessly pick away at the enemy's health. Combine this with rock and purple Pikmin, and you're basically set in terms of combat for the rest of the game. Some bosses can be taken down extremely easily, which can be fun to pull off, but it's a tad disappointing that the challenge can be lost. Thankfully, you won't really have an army of ice and purples large enough to effortlessly blast through enemies and bosses until fairly late in the game. That combined with the expanding Pikmin field limit over time is what also helps balance the Ice Pikmin in the main story. On top of combat, Ice Pikmin are also very useful for moving around the map to getting different treasures. Like I mentioned earlier, there's quite a lot of water in Pikmin 4, so freezing the water can be helpful for moving multiple treasures or objects across a body of water. There's also a new wall-like obstacle called Hydro Jelly, which requires ices to freeze before it can be broken by other Pikmin types. There are even regular walls that only ices can break as well. So overall, Ice Pikmin are extremely useful in Pikmin 4, and you'll likely have some with you throughout the main story.
I feel just like a purple Pikmin.
The last, and in my opinion, the best Pikmin type in the game is the purples, which make their grand return to the main story for the first time since Pikmin 2. I know they were also in Pikmin 3, but they were only relegated to the mission mode, and were pretty useless there due to their extremely limited and underwhelming abilities. When attacking enemies, they weren't even stronger than Red Pikmin. Their pound attack was completely useless and didn't do anything, and they didn't even latch onto enemies immediately. It took like a couple seconds. Thankfully, in Pikmin 4, the purples are very useful again. Not quite as overpowered as they were in 2, but 4 did fix their signature abilities. Their iconic pound attack is finally effective again, as it does 4 times their normal attack power, which is nearly twice as powerful as Rock Pikmin's normal attack. Their base attack power is also the same as red Pikmin, making them more balanced in combat. They also didn't bring back the chance for the pound to stun the enemy, which is another aspect that makes them more balanced in combat. You can stun the enemy anyway using Ochi's rush attack, so it doesn't really matter anyway. In one other addition that does make the purples a little overpowered though, is the fact that their pound creates a small shockwave that can kill multiple enemies at once. I'm not sure if this was exactly implemented in Pikmin 2, but it does feel a little different here. Their movement speed also seems to be slightly improved from Pikmin 2, meaning that they're not quite as slow as they used to be, though they still are slow, just they do seem to move slightly faster in this game. It does make it pretty useful for moving large objects back to the onion, which can be the case a lot later in the game, since there's quite a lot of heavy objects in the game. So overall, just like the Ice Pikmin, purples are once again OP in Pikmin 4, but thankfully, they don't break the game too much this time. So anyways, that was my ranking of the Pikmin types in Pikmin 4. It was pretty difficult to rank some of them, because as I mentioned previously, most of the types seem to be balanced fairly well, at least in terms of combat. And let me know what you think of my ranking down in the comments, and I'd also like to see how you would rank the Pikmin types in 4. So anyways, thank you guys for watching this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more, and make sure to check out my Discord server and Amazon affiliate link. Goodbye.